All right. So yeah, so I'm here to talk about points and token emissions. I think that would be most relevant to kind of where you guys are in the stage of the cohort, but obviously I'll also touch on, the overall topic and set some context. Just a disclaimer before we get started, this is for educational purposes only. I'm not giving any legal, financial, technical, or investment advice in this talk. So don't rely on anything in this for any official advice. So quickly about me. I'm the co-founder of Legion. Legion.cc is our website. We recently raised a round from Cyberfund. That's the fund of Constantine, co-founder of Lido, from Alliance DAO, from Delphi, from angels like Mike Dudas, John Wu, Alex S. of Nansen. We're launching a MiCA compliant platform for public token sales. So super excited about that. Prior to this role, I had multiple roles in token and mechanism design across the industry. So worked for Status, one of the OG ICOs in Ethereum, S&T token for Stacks, top 50 project these days, the L2 for Bitcoin. I've angel invested or advised, I think, over 30 projects at this point pre-token. And I've written an open source guide, open source book. It's free. Highly recommend checking it out since there's no cost, called Tokenomics for Builders, which has gotten some great positive reviews, great reception from founders at places like Monad, Elixir, Placeholder, Galaxy Interactive, Blue Yard, and as a few others. So I think, I don't have all the answers in this topic, and like no one really does, but I've seen a lot of projects from different angles and been in the industry for a number of years. Um, and so let's set the context, right? When we think about a token overall and tokenomics, there's many ways you can slice it. I think one of the most straightforward ways to slice it is thinking about two aspects. There's a supply side aspects and there's the demand side, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people only ever think about the supply side, right? Like total supply, allocation, emissions, vesting. This is what people think of oftentimes as tokenomics. They never even think about the demand side. The use cases, right? How does the user leverage the token in the protocol? And the incentive mechanisms. How does the protocol leverage the token to influence users? I have, as part of that free guide I mentioned, open source guide, there's also a canvas associated with that called the Tokenomics Design Canvas, which is a step-by-step process that you can follow to basically complete your whole design across, holistically across all of these aspects. Today, we don't really have time. It's quite, beyond the scope of just one session to get into every topic covered here, but we'll be focusing on some common mistakes on the supply side, especially as you approach kicking off your points programs, which probably lead into a TGE. Lots of mistakes to be made and oversights, and so let's briefly set some context and then look at some case studies to actually get some lessons from the real world. So I think it's important to think about where a token fits in to what you're building, right? Some people say the product is the token. That is not the philosophy I subscribe to, unless you are launching purely a meme coin, and that's what it's meant to be. But the product is really what you're building that creates value for users, right? So, for example, Uniswap makes it easier for me to trade, and that saves me time and money. It has literally created time and money that I didn't previously have when I had to use a worse competitor. The business model is capturing value, right? How you've created value for users. That means they should be willing to pay something for it. And so your business model is how you capture that value. For example, you could take a percentage of the fee from trades, right? That would be a usage-based business model. Your token then is how you really think about distributing value, right? And that can be distributing revenues to stakers, but there's lots of indirect ways or less direct ways as well. There's buybacks, there's supply sinks, there's, I need the token as a utility token. And so there's just a demand for the token for usage, and there's a limited quantity of it available, right? So people who have the token are being distributed value either directly or indirectly from the value that is captured and from the value that is ultimately created. It all starts with your product. And this is a warning sign. Again, even though we'll talk about a lot today, supply side, this is not an excuse to just forget about demand and not worry about it, right? If we think about this grid here, we have low demand, high demand, excess supply, scarce supply. It is not sufficient only to have scarce supply, right? So if we think about something with like low demand and excess value, right? Like sand is everywhere. There's not much demand for it. There's some, like in construction, but there's not like a ton of demand for sand. And there's a lot of excess supply. Sand is pretty cheap, right? If we think about scarce supply, like horse dung, maybe you live on a farm. I personally don't. Horses, once we replace them with cars, not too much horse poop, for better or worse, lying around. Pretty scarce supply, but also we don't really use that. We don't really use it for fuel or use it for anything. So yes, there's scarce supply, but there's also low demand. Not much of a price. I'm not sure what the latest market rate, but not much of a price on horse dung. High demand, excess supply, right? Air, for example, like we all need it. We're all using it all the time, all day long. Um, but there's so much of it that you still have low value. So really what we're talking about here when we're talking about value is high demand and scarce supply, or a balance of demand and supply. Taylor Swift is an expert at this. She's, unfortunately schooling a lot of Web3 founders in their knowledge of tokenomics. Taylor Swift tickets are very scarce and very high in demand and have high value. So the point here being, if you ignore demand, if you just only use supply and go scarce supply, you could very easily end up with a horse dung token, which you do not want. Drive this point home. We're going to look at a simple example. What I like about this example is that it's quantitative. It's literally every assumption that we're about to make is just written down here on this page, and the result is just pure mathematics. There is no additional other assumptions or randomness or any anything like that. So let's imagine we have $10 starting token price. Each period that elapses, 15% more tokens are created and given to existing holders. That's very similar to like staking rewards, right? Or like emissions to paid to staking token stakers. 50% of staking supply, starting supply rather, is providing liquidity in a Uniswap V2, AMM, a constant product AMM. Let's imagine 10% of the rewards that distributed are sold each period, right? So 15%, these staking rewards, that is 15% each period, 10% of those tokens are sold each period. No other tokens are bought or sold. And really, this is quite an optimistic scenario, right? In reality, there's probably more than 10% of the rewards are sold as farming rewards. You probably have large net selling pressures that start to kick in when the token price starts to decline because you have these, nonlinear kind of serially correlated events. And you probably don't have 50% of the circulating supply providing liquidity, right? So these are all kind of optimistic scenarios. But let's see what happens even in this optimistic scenario where there's no other buying or selling. Well, whose initial $10 investment is tracked here in blue, and the price per token is tracked here in red. And you can see that initially the blue goes up. And that's because even though the price per token is declining, people are getting staking rewards. And for a while, again, just purely, you could run the math yourself, right? Purely based on the assumptions we just talked about, purely based on how a Uniswap V2 pool works and how staking rewards will be paid out. For a while, people are getting richer overall, even though the token price per token is going down. And so people say, oh, we're going to the moon. Well, that starts to cap out, and then you start to get declining total portfolio value because the price per token fall has kind of accelerated. And you say, okay, stop fudding, right? Staking's still a nice yield. We're still up. Diamond hands, we're going to be a top 100 project. Oop, now we're down 50%. Can devs do something? And now I'm down 90%. Screw this project. I'm never using it again. So I like this example because it really demonstrates, if you don't have demand, if you just have these staking rewards and, it is inevitable, it is a mathematical truth that your token will go to zero effectively. Tokens as rewards, as Jason Choi of Tangent mentions, tokens as a reward are a go-to-market strategy and customer acquisition expenditure, not a business model, right? So it's about creating value, capturing value, and distributing value, but your token is about distributing value. Your token is not the thing that creates or captures value. So with that kind of context set, let's talk briefly about why do points and token emissions matter, right? If you think about a Web2 business, they don't have points and tokens. Is that because they're magic? Like, is that just because all points and tokens are scams? No. A Web2 business, the way they work, right, is basically a central operator actively directing buyers and sellers, right? You can think of like Uber, the Web2 app, right, that we've all used. Like Uber has proprietary algorithms. They have like a headquarters. They have an app. They have centralized management team. They are coordinating activity on their private app in their walled garden, right? Their tech, their algorithms, their data about users, and their operations are all proprietary. And so they have defensibility, right? Because they have secret tech, they have secret data, and they have network effects. If you were to try to compete with Uber, even setting aside having an army of drivers available on your app, you would first have to build comparable tech. You would then have to get enough data to be able to train your algorithms to match riders and drivers in a comparable way. It would just be a nightmare. Well, think about now a Web3 business, it's slightly different, right? In this case, smart contracts are passively controlling or facilitating interactions, right? You can't really control users. You can incentivize them to do things, but you can't force them to do things. And the technology and the operations are open source. You deploy a smart contract, it's on the blockchain, right? It's out there for everyone to see. So when you think about the defensibility of a Web3 business, you don't, largely speaking, have proprietary tech, or you have considerably less proprietary tech than the Web2 equivalent. You don't really have proprietary data because all the user data about using your product or interacting with the smart contracts is also on chain. All you have really is your network effects. And so let's talk about briefly network effects, and the cold start problem is related to this. And then that kind of explains, and we can see how a token fits into this. So um, in the context of like a social or messaging network, right? Like Facebook, I have no reason to join if my friend isn't always already on the network. But there's a paradox because my friend has no reason to join if I'm not there, right? And so this is known as the cold start problem, right? Also called the bootstrapping problem. It's effectively a chicken and egg problem, right? A trading network, right? Where you have buyers and sellers. Well, buyers have no one to buy from if sellers aren't already using the platform, but sellers have no one to sell to if buyers aren't already using the platform. So how do you even get started, right? You can't even convince one group to join because they're waiting on the other group. It's this recursion of recursive dependencies in developer speak. Services network, right? Like Uber. Users, riders can't get any service if drivers aren't on the app, and vice versa, right? So this is the cold start problem. Let's visualize it on a chart, right? Size of the network here, network value. You are here as a startup, and what you want to do is get here. And the idea is that you can eventually hit this kind of like inflection point of critical mass where you have enough users on both sides that you start to become especially valuable. The paradox, though, to get there is that you need more users to be useful to users. Yes, that's confusing. It's a paradox, right? You have to overcome this cold start problem. If you can get here to critical mass, your product becomes much more valuable, and your new competitors will start where you started, right? So like Binance is over here now. Other competitors, other sexes that are just starting now, start out here. And this difference in network value between new sexes and Binance in the red line, you can actually see that in the real world. This is not like a theoretical concept, right? Here's slippage for placing a trade on Binance and other sexes or former sexes. The red line here is that network effect benefit, right? You have more liquidity on Binance, which leads to more trading activity, which leads to more fees, which leads to more people wanting to provide liquidity and capture that bid offer spread, which leads to more trading activity, right? So it's this, again, the network effect is like this self-reinforcing aspect, which is why it is so hard for competitors to compete and so valuable for incumbents once you have a network effect. It provides a lot of defensibility, and this difference in network value is exactly what you're seeing here, where it's much more useful to trade on Binance than it is to trade on other sexes. So when we think now about how do we build a network effect, seems obvious, right? Let's just give everybody tokens and then we have a bunch of users and voila, we have a network effect. Um, Not quite that simple. Uh, there is a risk when you do that, if you just indiscriminately hand out tokens, that you basically pull your adoption curve forward, right? Because you're paying people to use the app, which is sure going to get people's attention. Sure, it's going to bring in users. Oops. Sure, it's going to bring in users, but um, you're at a risk of just shifting this curve to the left, right? So you got users who would have found about you later, now finding about you earlier. But if you're not ready to retain them, if your product isn't actually good, if you're not, if your retention metrics aren't there, if people wouldn't use your product for any other reason other than just getting paid to do so, inevitably, right, as we saw in the quantitative example, your token's going to hyperinflate or you're going to have to limit emissions. And as soon as those financial incentives dry up, well, guess what? People are going to leave, right? And so now you're in a situation where by handing out tokens indiscriminately, you've hyperinflated, you've tanked your token price, so you have terrible price momentum. You've burned your existing token holders. So you've got a group of people that are upset with you because you lost the money. You've got terrible metrics because you used to be bigger than you are in terms of, daily active users and all these things. So no VCs will touch you. And basically you're dead in the water. And you did this by attracting people before you were ready, by giving out tokens just, indiscriminately. So really one of the biggest mistakes that teams make is paying out tokens, again, not in proportion to the value that a user is bringing to the network, and then also launching a liquid token too early, before you have some degree of product market fit, before you have some degree of being able to actually retain your users, because attracting users is easy if you're paying them. Retaining users is everything. So I want to, again, drive this point home by looking at a theoretical example, and then we're going to talk about some case studies. We're going to imagine the same identical product, but with two different tokenomics approaches, and see how it plays out, right? And so in this case, we're talking about a Web3 version of Uber, competing with the Web2. So imagine in this Web3 case, Uber on the blockchain. Option A, approach to tokenomics. Riders can pay, in the UBR token. Drivers get this extra drive to earn emission. Riders get, some of their tokens back that they paid in ride to earn emissions. The UBR supply keeps inflating. Drivers sell their UBR, right, to pay for bills, because their bills of gasoline and insurance are definitely not going to be accepted in UBR, right? They're going to need US dollars. So they got to sell some of these tokens they're earning. As soon as the price starts declining in token, the token price starts declining, more drivers start selling their Uber, because they don't want to be caught with, oh, I earned what used to be $20 worth of Uber, now it's only $18, and I got a bill for my insurance tomorrow for $50. Like, I better sell now before this ends up zero and I'm totally screwed. So the Uber price crashes, and no drivers want to accept Uber anymore, and no drivers available means there's no way to use the product. So literally the product is dead because of the tokenomics. Now let's look at another approach to this. Doesn't mean it's going to guaranteed play out this way, but let's see kind of what's more likely to happen. Okay, in this case, riders can pay for rides in Uber, same as before. Whenever a rider pays for a ride, some percentage of the token is burned, and let's make that X percent lower than Uber 2.0's cut. Like, let's say I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say Uber takes like a 30% margin. So we'll burn 20% of tokens that users pay for. A driver is still taking home more of a cut than Uber 2.0, and so a random driver would rather drive for Uber Web3, right, than Web2. So this works, right? There's nothing unstable about this per se. The UBR token supply becomes deflationary because we're burning a bunch of tokens as people use it, right? The more people use it, the more tokens are burned. Token price appreciates, drawing more attention from drivers and riders. The cost of a ride in UBR terms floats with the free market, right? But implied in USD stays steady. So point A to point B is a $20 ride. as the price of UBR token per USD appreciates, that just means I need fewer UBR tokens to pay for the ride, but I wouldn't price the ride, if you start increasing the ride price in USD, you're going to be in trouble. So again, the price expressed in tokens floats and will decline if the price of the token is going up, but users are still paying the same USD terms, so they're still happy to use the app. And so more usage causes higher, UBR price, causes more usage of attention and users, etc. So again, not guaranteed by any means to play out this way, but two radically different approaches, outcomes from two different approaches, right? In one case, the tokenomics literally killed the product. In the other case, it facilitated the product growing and coming to market, right? A token can't really help a dead product or a product that no one wants to use, but it can accelerate a decent product that actually has product market fit. So as we just talked about, clearly the right tokenomics are very important, right? Network effects are largely your only source of defensibility in open source decentralized projects. Users have to be incentivized to act. You can't force users to do things like in a Web2 business or a central entity, right? Like Facebook can ban people, can force software updates, right? Can shadow ban, can do all sorts of things. Can't really do that, right? In Web3, you can't even force miners to upgrade, right? It's just the incentives need to be there. Tokenomics is this tool set at your disposal to achieve network effect and incentivize things. Tokens can accelerate reaching critical mass. That is true, but it can also, steer user behavior for good or bad, right? They're double-edged swords. They can lead to fake adoption and bad user behavior just as easily as they can lead to actual organic adoption. There are many, many, many historical, use cases to learn from, of mistakes to avoid. Some of my personal favorites are Steemit. I'm surprised actually that how few people are still familiar with it, but Steemit was like a really big social media platform. Like it was pitching itself as Web3 YouTube or Web3 Tumblr back in 2017 days. And you would earn tokens for making posts. And if your post got more upvotes, you would earn more tokens. And if you curated a post, right, if you upvoted a good post early, you also got tokens. Well, in theory, this rewards quality over quantity. In practice, all you had was a bunch of bots upvoting themselves, and you got spam, right? As the inevitable result of the incentives were actually just to have bad user behavior of everybody just spams a bunch of crappy content and upvotes themselves. So didn't work out in Steemit's case because they didn't think about the right way to incentivize user behavior. UST or Luna, another classic example, of course, where they were incentivizing borrowing, or excuse me, they were incentivizing lending, right? Like basically capturing this 20% APY and not incentivizing the actual borrowing that was going to funding that yield without inflation or emissions, right? If you had enough borrowers, you actually could organically fund a yield, but they had this fixed 20% APY, and it wasn't wholly funded by the actual organic activity happening. It was just funded in part by inflationary printing. And that also led to a death spiral because as that gap grew, you had more inflationary printing you needed to do, which further worsened the price, which further increased the gap. So you get these recursive relationships oftentimes that lead to spirals, which is why it's again so important to get your tokenomics right and make sure you're incentivizing the right behavior. LooksRare, similar example. These days, like LooksRare is an NFT marketplace, something like 80% or more of trading activity on LooksRare is just wash trading, people trading with themselves in order to earn token emissions, not real organic users trading. And a lot of web or a lot of early play to earn games also are great cautionary tales like Axie Infinity or Steppen, which both had yes, they had great metrics at one point and they get a lot of players, and to some degree they're still well respected names, but they also hyperinflated and are nowhere near their peak levels of both market cap and daily active users. So the right tokenomics are important. You can't just distribute your token indiscriminately to people and think that will mean, oh hey, I'm building a network effect. So now let's talk about designing points and token emissions and look at some actual practical case studies. So when we think about the challenge here, right? The goal, as we've been talking about, is to attract and retain organic and loyal users. Why? Because that helps us build a network effect, and that's the only thing that's really going to keep us around in the long term. Rewards here should be designed to attract these organic users as much as possible while attracting mercenaries as little as possible, right? This is obviously easier said than done, but this is kind of the constraints we need to operate in, right? We want to maximize the amount of organic users we get and minimize the amount of bots we get, right? You're never going to fully eliminate all mercenaries or bots, but you can get more noise relative, excuse me, more signal relative to noise. GMX's escrowed staking rewards are one example of doing this, right? For those not familiar, instead of just paying out staking rewards as immediately liquid and you can trade them, you can sell them, you can dump them, staking rewards on GMX actually, to simplify it, they kind of vest over time, right? You don't immediately get them unlocked. You have to kind of wait a while to then sell them or transfer them. And so what this does is it shifts the ROI for mercenary capital, right? Mercenary capital is not necessarily interested in using GMX, not necessarily interested in expressing a long position or a bull thesis on GMX if they buy the token. They're just trying to farm it and dump it, right? And so if you're saying, well, sure, you can farm it, but you're not able to dump it, right? You're going to have the longer to sell your rewards. Well, now, unless I'm very bullish or confident GMX, that means I'm taking on additional risk that I don't necessarily want as a mercenary. I'm just going to go elsewhere where I can just farm the token and immediately dump it and have very little risk and guaranteed reward of the inflation. Whereas if you're an organic user, you're a fan of GMX, you're going to use it anyway. Maybe you're long the token, so you're going to be bull anyway. You don't really care that you can't immediately dump the rewards you're getting because you plan to hold them longer term anyway. And so this is one example of a mechanism that doesn't really punish any organic and loyal users, so hits that point, but does minimize the benefit for mercenaries. And so you've reduced the number of mercenaries relative to organic users with this mechanism. Not saying it's perfect, but that's one example to just drive home the point of like how we could achieve this thing in practice. So we want to attract organic and loyal users, and we want to minimize mercenaries. Another thing we want to keep in mind when doing this is to find your North Star metric that you want to reward, right? Uniswap, is that liquidity providers or is that traders, for example, right? On Friendtech, should we reward buying keys, which they did, or should we reward creating content? Now, it's not necessarily easy to reward creating content, as Steemit learned, but I think as we've all seen, how Friendtech approached it of just this rewarding this hyper speculative behavior was good for a short burst, but didn't actually lead to any organic adoption or organic usage of the platform. No one was, creating recurring content on it. I don't think they picked the right North Star metric. For Uniswap, they, reward liquidity providers. You have more liquidity providers. That means there's less slippage, which allows, more trading activity to happen. So that seems to be more like the right North Star metric in their case. And your challenge is to find what is this North Star metric where I want to direct the bulk of or most of my incentives to reward that behavior, because organic and loyal users will either come because they're the ones that do that behavior, or that behavior enables, organic and loyal users. And it could be a mix of both, right? You might have organic users that are both liquidity providers, and because you have now high liquidity, you also are able to bring in organic traders that legitimately want to put on trades and express express directional bets and need low slippage in order to do that, right? They're not just there to wash trade and earn the token. So find your North Star metric, right, in order to reward organic loyal users as much as possible while minimizing how much you're rewarding mercenaries. Design rewards to drive that metric, and use, I would say, longer periods of time and capped emissions rates to ensure a balance of emissions, right? What you don't want is some whale coming in at the last minute and earning like 90% of the available emissions, right? And so if you use capped emissions rates from period to period, right? Like we're going to emit, just for example, 1 million points per epoch, right? That means that, okay, if a whale comes in at the very last epoch, well, the most points they can earn is 1 million. And so if you had loyal users before that, they were earning a fair share, a fair share, a fair share. And sure, the whale comes in at the last minute, but they're most going to get, let's say you ran that for 10 epochs, they're most going to get 10% of points. Well, if you don't have epochs and the whale comes in at the last minute, they could very much easily end up earning 90% of total points, right? And so I think capped emission rates are one trick to achieve this best and reward actual organic users. And then longer windows of time, right? Like if you have, it's again a balance, right? Because you don't want epochs to be too long. But if your epoch is like 24 hours, you could have lots of volatility in organic usage, right? From day to day. And so a whale could easily, or someone could easily manipulate that. So you want to find, again, it's a balance for your use case, but like what's a window of time for your use case where it's not super volatile and it's like not like you just randomly have no organic users. So some mercenary can come in and see that and maliciously farm and do wash trading to earn most of the points. So long enough where that doesn't happen, but short enough where, a whale can't come in at the last minute and earn all the points. And I think that's going to be somewhat dependent on your product and what people use it to do. I would also advise that, well, okay, I shouldn't use the word advise. Again, this is not, legal advice or anything like that. But in general, I think it's best if projects don't run their points program for more than 3 months. You've seen cases where projects have done that and people just kind of get fatigued, right? They get sick of this like points that is that going to ever convert into something? Like, what's the conversion rate? Like, what are we doing here? We're earning these, entries in a centralized database. There are exceptions, but I think, people get kind of exhausted when it goes longer than 3 months. And I think another thing to aim for that would be evidence of that you're doing a good job is that your OG users should really remain in your points rankings, right? Like if the users you had before you even announced a points program, if none of them are in your top, 10, 20, 50 points holders, like that's a warning sign that you have not calibrated your points program very well because you've had, sure, they might be smaller and maybe you've had, whales come in that are using it now, but they're probably just farming you and you're not actually rewarding the people that were here even before the points program was announced. And so it doesn't guarantee that you're misallocating resources, but it's a warning sign that, hey, you might want to revisit how you're calibrating your points program. So that's a common mistake. And so let's go through just a few others and then get some case studies. So publishing the exact formulas for points, I would say that's usually not something you want to do. One, the more details you give people, the more you give them to complain about and nitpick. So unfortunately, it's kind of just annoying, but that's how it works. Two, you're making it a lot more gameable because someone says, ooh, here are the rules. Great. I can build a bot that just automates and treats it as an optimization function and just extracts as much value as possible. And three, there's legal risks, actually. If you're communicating like points convert into an airdrop, and you shouldn't be giving an airdrop to everyone anyway. Like you can actually get in, it creates some legal risks. Again, speak to your lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but surprisingly, there are legal risks involved if you do. Rewarding the wrong types of users or behaviors. Obviously, we talked about that. That's obviously a big mistake. Not properly rewarding OG users, right? We just talked about that. That's a common mistake. Putting points on chain and like making them hyper speculative. I don't think to make like, sure, I joked about points being these silly like off-chain centralized database things, but like I think points on chain makes even less sense. You're literally describing just a worse version of a token. The main benefit, if not the only benefit of points, is that you can quickly spin them up and there's like less overhead and you don't have to worry about auditing smart contracts and all this nonsense, right? So being off chain is actually like the main benefit of running of points. And so I don't see the purpose of putting them on chain and make them tradable and hyper. Like I think that's a big factor of why so many people were disappointed with the Eigen airdrop is think about how many protocols out there were doing like such hyper leveraged farming and like all this attention was on, farming the Eigen airdrop, it was doomed. It couldn't possibly have lived up to the hype. And so I think that's also a common mistake projects make, is like going too hyper speculative on their points. Rewarding vanity metrics, again, metrics easy to bot, like following, right, or liking a post. Sure, you can reward that a bit, but you really need to be careful about calibrating it where that's not, a meaningful reward compared to something useful, like a real metric, like actually using the platform, paying fees. Continuing to run a points program even when the market's in a bull market, and you should launch your token. Like, over timing the market is a big mistake. I've spoken to way more projects that regret not having launched the token earlier than regret having launched the token in a bear market, right? Like, yes, projects overall do launch tokens before they're ready. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to you're ready to launch your token, but you're trying to time the market. Well, it's much more common to miss your timing and launch it after the bull market happened than to launch it and feel like, oh, we were too early. Like, we should have waited another month, and because now is the bull market. Easy trap to fall into. Finally, focusing on making your points program like 100% automated and objective instead of making it accurate. Like, do things that don't scale, right? You're going to run your points program once. It's going to be painful. You're going to be busy, but it's one of the highest ROI things you can do is get your token into the hands of the right people. And if you're worried about making it like perfectly automated so it's easy to run, it also makes it easy to bot, right? If you make it more difficult where, we're just going to organically hand out rewards to people who are posting great threads about us, or, big users, these sorts of things that are less objective, sure, more subjective, less automated, yes, but more valuable and more accurate to capture who's actually adding value and who should be rewarded. So really briefly, I know we're coming up on time of what I wanted to reserve for questions, but let's go through a couple case studies. So Glyph.io, they're running a points program right now. It's a storage provider that rents, Filecoin space. One thing I like about what they're doing here, right, or the points program works, they have a capped number of points to hand out. Those are split into their own capped buckets of a historical bucket and a future allocation bucket. And those are then split into capped buckets of, there's this one group of storage providers that we're going to reward, and there's this other group of liquidity providers that we're going to reward. Notice how these are capped and split. So you don't get the situation where, okay, well, not many people are providing liquidity, but there's a ton providing storage. So you end up, getting all the points go to storage providers. But maybe you equally need liquidity providers, right? So by putting these caps on, by putting these buckets in place, you are ensuring that you are proportionally rewarding what you need to reward. I'm not saying a 50-50 split is necessarily the best, right? Maybe it's more valuable, like, to actually have liquidity, so it should be 25-75 or something like that. But I do like that it's capped and bucketed. So what it does well in this case is it ensures historical users get 2/3 of total points, right? Like, people who have been using it before are guaranteed in aggregate to get 50 million points out of the 75. So even if a bunch of whales show up now, the most of those whales are going to get is 1/3. Your OG users are guaranteed to get 50 million on aggregate. It makes it clear what activities earn points, but it doesn't publish the exact formulas, which is, again, a strength, I would argue. Perhaps there's nonlinear decays that if I knew about, if the formulas were published, I would Sybil attack, right? So it's good that it doesn't. And its points are tied to North Star metrics, fees generated, right? So actually, each agent earns a portion of the points based on its pro rata share of the total fees paid to the pool. So you pay fees because you're using the app, great, you get points, right? Pretty strong North Star metric. What they could improve is, I think it runs way too long. It runs for like 6 months, and there's no referral benefits, which can be very powerful. So not perfect, but does a few things well. Drift, another great example of a recent points program. What it does well is they only ran it for 3 months. The leaderboard updated weekly instead of daily. This is exactly a case of what I was talking about, right? This allows you to reward activities that might not happen every day. And so you can better reflect, longer term consistent usage rather than like quote unquote winners of random low activity days, right? Like maybe there's not much trading activity on one day. If your epochs, if your updates were every day, like someone could just randomly get a bunch of points, even though they don't necessarily quote unquote deserve it. So yeah, weekly epochs I think made a lot of sense in this context. They're not super long, but they're long enough to smoothen out volatility. No exact formula is published. It protects the OGs because they had this separate category of OG points. So they basically calibrated and ensured that like OGs who used the drift before the points program was announced did get a proportional number of points. It's not like they got diluted by whales coming in. Points were tied to a key metrics of providing liquidity and trading, and max amounts of points per week, right? Each week was itself bucketed, meant that, just because there was a bull market or suddenly trading activity went up, doesn't mean that, again, earlier users get diluted for no reason. And then could improve, honestly, not much. I think Drift is a great example of a points program that was run very well. And you can kind of see that in what they do. This is a tweet from one of the founders this week. In Drift is the highest volume week post airdrop without any points, right? So after they ended their rewards and their points program, and you can see obviously, like every protocol, you're going to have a drop off after you do your final token distribution and end your kind of programs. But they did steeply drop off, but they've remained steady after that. Cumulative volume has continued to grow. Obviously, I mean that's a tautology, but they've recovered to about half the maybe activity recently than when they were running their points program. We'll look at another example next where that's not necessarily the case, right? And TVL certainly has remained steady. You don't have this sudden sharp drop off of TBL after the points program ended, which is another good indication that Drift, successfully attracted organic users and didn't just have a bunch of mercenaries that just immediately left to go on to the next thing when their points program ended. And you can kind of see, the results of that in their token prices remained stable. This is not most up to date, but I think it's even higher than that now. It's, there was some volatility around launch or around airdrop, of course, but certainly better than a lot of projects out there whose tokens have just gone, down only after the airdrop. Which brings us to case study number 3, unfortunately. Parcel, also a perp dex on Solana. So I like this because Drift and Parcel are actually similar products in the same ecosystem, and they did their points programs and token distribution around the exact same time. They were like 1 month apart. So these are great kind of control groups to compare how they approached it. In this case, they published very clearly exactly how many points you get for doing certain things. So they effectively did publish the formulas. What they did well was points were tied to key metrics, right? Like if you trade in general, if you pay fees, you get points. And they had a referral program, but they ran it for 4 months, including when Solana was pumping, and they were ready to launch, but they just kept running the points program because they didn't want to. They had kind of said they would run this, and then they didn't want to end it early, which they regret in hindsight. The exact formulas were published, which allowed for gaming the system, and points were updated daily and uncapped. And as a result of that, the top 5 wallets really heavily dominated the entire program. You had, these 5 whales who were just orders of magnitude larger than other users. And you had effectively no protection for OGs. The first place points leader at the time the points program was announced and launched was 33rd in overall points by the time the program ended. And the reason I know this is because I was that user, and call me salty, but the fact that your number 1 points leader wasn't even in your top 25 by the time the points program was over, a good indication that you let a bunch of whales come in and just dominate the whole program, and instead of adequately rewarding your early users. And as a result, I would argue you can directly see that in the metrics, right? Unlike the Drift TVL, which stayed steady and grew, Parcel, you can see very clearly where the points program began and where the airdrop happened and the points program ended, right? So there are real world consequences to these subtle differences in how you design your program. And Unfortunately, just as Drift token looked even better than the chart in the slides, Parcels token looks even worse than this chart in the slides. I think it's sub 20 cents these days. Friendtech, I don't know if it's worth talking about this. We'll just really briefly, right? They didn't publish exact formulas. Great, they did that well, but they ran it way too long. They ran their points program for like 6 months, and they heavily rewarded, wallet size, rewarded speculative behavior, didn't reward creating unique content or driving usage. They had the wrong North Star metric, and I think we all know how that story ended. Pretty a Shakespearean tragedy for Friendtech. Yeah, this is effectively zero now, I'm sure, these days. So TLDR, to sum up, we talked about emissions, but please don't take that as meaning that demand doesn't matter, right? Demand matters even more. When you're thinking about your points and your emissions, align the value distributed to the value that your users are adding to your network. You should think of points programs and tokens in general as a way to accelerate existing organic usage, not to create usage. You want to be sure that your OGs are rewarded for being OGs, and your tokens and points submissions, a good mental model is their gasoline, not matches, right? They're not going to start a fire, but they can greatly accelerate the product market fit and retention you have. Tushar from Multicoin, really respect his thinking a lot. Organic growth is infinitely more valuable than token incentivized growth, which is a great quote to sum up my last hour of talking. He's much more succinct than I am. So that's everything. Happy to field some questions. And if you want to stay in touch, my handle is Matty Tokenomics on pretty much every platform that is out there.